Okay, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the latest installment of the Intersection webinar with the Hunt Institute. My name is Patrick Sims. I'm the Director of Policy and Research at the Hunt Institute. We are very pleased to have you all join us for a really important discussion. I know something that is weighing heavily on each of your minds on the topic of school finance, especially in relation to COVID-19. We know unemployment rates peaking at unprecedented levels, and state revenues will be impacted in ways that will lead to very difficult decisions that have to be made among policymakers. We today are joined with, by three experts who represent different roles in their respective states. And so we're really excited to firstly have Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, Glenn Hegar, as well as Deputy Superintendent Nancy Williams, the Chief Financial Officer with the South Carolina Department of Education, and Dr. Thomas Taylor, Deputy Superintendent for Chesterfield County Public Schools in Virginia. Really quickly, before we get started, I want to share a few logistical notes. We do welcome you all to tweet throughout, and if so, we ask that you would please use the hashtag INTW or INT webinar, We'd love to hear questions, thoughts, comments, just sharing your own thoughts with everybody else who's participating today. We're going to keep all participants, attendees on mute throughout, but we would love to have questions from you. You have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, so please use that, and we're going to get to as many questions as possible. Next, I'd like to welcome the Hunt Institute's President and CEO, Dr. Javed Siddiqui, to open up the webinar. Over to you, Javed.
Thanks, Patrick. And thanks to all for joining us today. And special thanks to Deputy Superintendent Williams, Dr. Taylor, and our Hunt Fellow, Comptroller Glenn Hegar, for taking the time to share your insights this afternoon. I know how busy all of you are during this time, so very much appreciate you taking the opportunity to interface with all of us. I have the good fortune of serving as the president of the Hunt Institute. We at the Institute recognize the importance of prioritizing education funding to ensure that all students have equal access to a high-quality education. As Patrick mentioned, COVID-19 has placed a tremendous financial strain on countless Americans, which will certainly have a cumulative impact on our state economies and thus state revenues. It is incumbent upon state policymakers and district leaders alike to think innovatively to ensure that schools have the appropriate funding to provide the best possible education for our students. I myself, as a former school board member, I'm thankful I'm not on the board because I know how much stress and pressure is going to be on local leaders in this time. So we stand with you in solidarity and are thinking about you. And we're hopeful this conversation will be instructive to many of our teachers and superintendents and school board members and state lawmakers across the country that are with us this afternoon. Finally, if you just engage in this critical conversation here today, these three experts I have no doubt will be pushing our thinking on this topic. So no matter what role you are currently serving in, the Hunt Institute stands ready to support you in whatever way we can. If there's anything we can do to support you in making equitable and meaningful decisions for students' education, please don't hesitate to reach out to our team. I'd be remiss not to mention that our team at the Institute is working hard to compile as many resources and learning opportunities as possible during this really unprecedented time. We've created a host of materials related to policy issues across the education continuum, and I would encourage you to check them out. Our website, which I'm sure will be shared, huntinstitute.org, can provide you with any of those resources. But once again, please don't please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you need any help or support. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Patrick to get this conversation going. Patrick.
Great, thanks so much, Javed. So as I mentioned, we're fortunate to have perspectives, or three different perspectives for this conversation. And to start with, we would like to talk to hear from Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts, Glenn Hegar, who has authority over the entire state's budget, not simply education. So would you mind starting off, Comptroller, by giving us a brief overview of education funding in Texas and how the economic impacts of COVID-19 will likely impact education funding in the state?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. In Texas, we have a little over 1,000 local ISDs and charter schools. So we have a lot of school districts here in the state of Texas. Obviously, they're all very different in size, scope, local funding assets, states. So the funding here in Texas is a combination of local property taxes and state revenue. While most have thought traditionally that funding here in Texas, and even among policymakers here in the state, is split evenly 50-50, in fact, the formulas first consider local property taxes first, and then the state adds money into it additionally. Also, one thing that we've had in Texas historically year after year for quite some time is our average population has increased by about 1,000 people a day in Texas. Roughly half of that is natural growth, and then half of that is also net migration into Texas. And so I make that point typically because property values have traditionally increased every year here in the state of Texas because of that growth. And this means that as the values increase, the local share of public education funding has increased while the state share has actually decreased on an annual basis. And over time, the local share increases to such a point that then the legislature, as we did in 2005 and then again in 2019, added significant state dollars into the system to increase the state share and thus decrease the local share. Further, one point to note that is in 2019, the last legislative session, the state made an ongoing commitment to additionally compress local tax rates over time, which some asked whether that was sustainable even during strong economic growth here in the state of Texas, as Texas has typically outpaced the national average year after year in economic growth, just with the exception of a few times when we've had downturns in manufacturing and oil and gas. But with the economic contraction due to COVID, and then also Texas has the additional headwind in front of us from an economic perspective because of the rapid deterioration in oil price. And so therefore, and say, for example, Texas is typically, we're not an oil-based economy. Certain regions are, but we're a much more diverse economy than we used to be by far. However, it's nice to have those revenues. And for example, we've historically been about 50% of all the active rigs operating in all of North America for the last several years. And because of the rapid decline in oil prices and production in the last few months, we're down to 40%. And so the point being is you don't have significantly the same economic activity as you had before. And so therefore we have a little bit more of a headwind, at least in the immediate future, because of then in addition to just COVID. And so I noted to state leadership last month that the state share of public education funding will probably also increase from a state level, as undoubtedly we're going to have fewer property taxes in some ISDs because of lower mineral values from oil prices and a decrease in probably retail value and commercial values, as you see a lot of companies, whether it's your big box stores, you've seen bankruptcies being announced, closing stores, but also mom and pop small stores that no one has in their business plan that they're going to have essentially shut down for several weeks or as we've gone through social distancing. And so the point being is we feel as though there'll be some disruption in the retail space and ultimately in the commercial space as businesses decide to start shrinking their on-site footprint of individuals. And so point being is I wanted to go ahead and note that early on to policymakers that if you look at the course of the last 20 years, Texas, we only had one decrease in property values, and that was about 1.7%, and that was right after the great financial crisis. And so, we really don't know exactly what this is going to be, and we value property here in the state of Texas as of January 1. So January 1 of 2021 will be the new valuations for local property taxes. And so the point being is we know for a fact there'll be lower values in those school districts that heavily dependent on mineral values. We're probably going to see some decreases in certain areas for retail, and it'll probably be more over time that we'll see commercial, at least here in the upcoming year, but it'll continue to decrease. And so that's kind of really a snapshot of how our system works and kind of how we see it impacting potentially in the upcoming legislative session for the state. And we can get more into the local side here as we get through the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, Comptroller. It's very helpful context for us as we think about this discussion on a larger picture. Next, we're going to hear from a state education agency's perspective with Deputy Superintendent Nancy Williams from South Carolina. Deputy Superintendent, could you give us an overview of how South Carolina funds its education system and what some of the economic impacts you see from COVID-19 being on the funding for education in the state?
Certainly. And thank you first, Patrick and Javid, for the introduction and for today's invitation. South Carolina has a hybrid approach to funding K-12 education at the state level for its 79 traditional school districts and its 2 statewide charter authorizers. The largest portion of the K-12 funding at the state level is appropriated through our foundational educational funding program, which was established back in the Education and Finance Act of 1977. And that act pretty much details the responsibility of the state and those local school districts for financing our elementary and secondary education on a formula basis. Now that formula distributes state funds based on local property tax wealth and weighted pupil units, which consider the additional costs associated with educating specific populations of students. 70% of that statewide cost for that foundation program is paid by the state, and then 30% is paid collectively by local school districts. However, of course, each individual school district's percentage vary based upon the local property tax wealth of that individual district and the district's weighted pupil units. In addition to funding appropriated through our base education formula, there is additional state categorical funding that's appropriated for K-12 education. There's a sizable portion of funding for K-12 education that's disseminated back to our local school districts in the form of local government property tax relief. Right now, because sales tax, individual income tax, and then corporate tax comprise the overwhelming majority of the funding in the general fund, and such a sizable percentage is spent on K-12 education, there is still a great deal of uncertainty related to revenue collections for the remainder of this fiscal year, and then as it relates to the FY21 revenue estimates. Before the pandemic, South Carolina was projecting a surplus of approximately $1.9 billion for FY21, with more than $800 million in recurring revenue. This was a sizable projection considering South Carolina has roughly an $8.5 billion general fund budget. The revenue projections presented last month by the Board of Economic Advisors still reflects a revenue surplus for FY21, but certainly one that's roughly 70% less than what was initially projected. So right now, budget experts across the state are just hoping that the state can avoid any reductions in our base budget. As you may be aware, like several states, South Carolina has passed a continuing resolution to fund government operations for FY21 at FY20 levels until a budget can be passed. As of now, we are expecting the South Carolina General Assembly to return in September to work on a budget for the state. Prior to the pandemic, again, the state superintendent of education initially requested a 5% teacher salary increase and a $75 per pupil increase to our base education funding formula for FY21. In early March, prior to all of this, the SC House of Representatives passed a budget that included a $3,000 pay increase for all teachers. The continuing resolution, of course, when it passed, it didn't include any increases, but it also froze the South Carolina state minimum salary schedule at FY20 levels. And it also suspended the annual step increase that teachers in the state receive based upon their years of experience. So additionally, in the House's version of the budget back in March, they included $76 million for instructional materials in the state. Due to all of the economic uncertainty we've had at the state level, we've had to notify, of course, the State Board of Education, school districts, and publishers that we will have to postpone the 2020 instruction materials call for bid, but just because there's so much uncertainty with the level of funding. Additionally, the House's version of the budget included funding for public 4K expansion or universal 4K. And again, the current uncertainty will lessen the possibility that that expansion will happen in the immediate future. So those are just some of the ways that I see how the pandemic has impacted our priorities here in South Carolina.
Great, thank you so much. It's very helpful background. And I should note too that with all three of our guests today, we've also featured at in recent weeks their superintendent or commissioners of education. And so if you'd like to hear from them more directly, you can go to our website and find a video there where they're talking a little bit about how they're viewing the response to COVID-19 as well. And this will also be made available on our website for those of you who would like to come back to it later. So with that, Dr. Taylor, I'm going to turn over to you to hear a little more about a district perspective. Could you share a little bit about how you're thinking about potential upcoming budget cuts and what a district really needs to be considering right now?
Well, thank you, Patrick, and thank you to the Hunt Institute for hosting this important conversation. A little bit about my particular local education agency. Chesterfield, Virginia is bedroom communities southwest of Richmond, Virginia, the capital. We have about 63,000 students in our school system, which makes us the 5th largest in Virginia and the 67th largest school system in the United States. In many ways, we're a microcosm of the rest of the state. We're a minority-majority school division with a rapidly growing ESL population. Nearly 40% of our students participate in the federal free lunch program, and all of our schools are fully state accredited and meet national benchmarks. So the long story short is that we're a large, diverse, but high-performing LEA. Because of the characteristics of our school division and our close proximity to the state capital, we are frequently working in conjunction with our state education agency to address policy issues facing the state and also participate in a lot of pilot projects for scalability. So hearing a lot from our state agencies, we hear a lot of the same narrative happening across the country as well here in Virginia. We're financed very similarly from the state, where approximately half of our revenue in Chesterfield comes from our SEA. And as a result of that, that formula is based primarily off of real estate value and property value, then followed by income tax revenues, as well as a small portion being factored by sales tax revenue and benchmarked against population and student population. Some of the ways that we're having to face this issue, or really any issue in fiscal retrenchment, particularly after this historic 128-month expansion. And of course, today's news tells us what we already know, is that we are in a recession and have been for several months. And the major themes still ring true, whether you're in this recession or another recession, which is that revenues are projected to be down and expenses correspondingly are projected to be up. The biggest and most confounding difference is that expenses for this particular recession are significantly up because of the nature of the financial crisis that we're in. So in response, LEAs have about 5 or 6 steps that they need to think through in adjusting their budgets for fiscal 21 and beyond. First things first, for any LEA, you need to take a hard look at your base budget and fund all regulatory requirements. In Virginia, this is primarily tied to state staffing standards. In Chesterfield, like most school divisions in Virginia, we're approximately 80% personnel expense, where this is higher in a lot of other states, but we're approximately 80% personnel expense. In Virginia, about 8% debt service and about 12% operating, with about 1% being discretionary expenditure. So we're pretty tight at a state average and a local average of around $11,000 per pupil in funding. And many other states are similar, or right around there, or maybe even have less, which means that every dollar gets stretched very closely. And anytime you're talking about any kind of reduction, you have to look at personnel expense, and that is one of the key targets for today's conversation as well. So anytime you revisit the base budget, it feels, looks, and smells an awful lot like zero-based budgeting, and it feels the same way in terms of its restrictions and challenges, but we can always find things in the base to be the first area that we trim. The second, LEA should be looking at honoring all their contractual obligations. This is primarily any debt service, pension liability expense, benefits, educational contracts that are already underway, things of that nature. LEAs then need to look at deferring any particular expenses for any non-essential major maintenance, any small asset replacement, taking a look at your bus replacement cycle and things of that nature, and whether or not you need to make modifications to that rather than funding the entire replacement cycle. And then, of course, curbing any additional expansion efforts. The first thing that's usually cut in the private sector, particularly in our Fortune 500 world, is research and development. And we're no different than that. So a lot of our innovations are usually the first things to come off of the table when we're looking at any new spend or any new additions to the fiscal budget. It's also important to note that any deferred expense is not money saved, it's just money deferred. That problem doesn't go away. And if we could impress anything upon our policymakers, it's to remember that anything that we're not spending in terms of replacement or maintenance or something along those lines is effectively kicking the can down the road another year, and may even cause a more significant cost down the road. Fourth, I'd be mindful of what I like to call the capital expense conundrum, especially in this situation. Yes, the cost of capital is relatively cheap right now, and debt for capital construction may sound like a great idea, and normally it is in situations like this. But the reality is that even if you floated a bond to your citizens right now, in many communities, they may not want to incur the additional tax, and you may even be in a situation where you're having trouble selling bonds. And if you're in a community like ours where we're AAA rated, the payout is even below inflation. So even if you could sell a bond to your community from a political standpoint, the reality of trying to sell a bond in the open market to gain debt service for capital construction may even be a challenge. Finally, and probably most germane to today, is the need to assess how our existing circumstances are impacted by the cause of the financial disruption. In this case, the financial disruption was caused by COVID-19. And I think that that's a great segue into our next topic.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor. That is really helpful to think about the logistically the steps that you all need to go through as you approach this really difficult and challenging situation. So I'm going to go with another round of questions for our three panelists, and then we will certainly open it up to Q&A. So please do put your questions into the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to come back to you, Dr. Taylor, and I think to your point here with the fifth one, right now you have to make decisions with limited information about next school year. And how do you do that going into it and balancing all the needs that you know that students have coming into the fall?
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. What a roller coaster ride it's been for all of us. And I think, like everyone, our priorities have shifted from month to month, and they'll continue to shift. Like most states, we operate, we'll open operations in the fall largely predicated on our governor's direction. And we are working in close partnership and proximity to our state education agency, and that's a critical pipeline. I can't underscore that enough. The relationship between the SEA and the LEA at this point, and the communication pipeline, how valuable that really is. I've talked a little bit about how we're funded in Virginia, where about half of our revenues come from the state and the other half coming from the locality for the most part, and very little from the federal government. But real estate revenues from property tax are pretty stable, particularly in this environment, relatively speaking, by comparison to our state revenues. Where our state revenues are primarily made up of income tax, sales tax, and lottery proceeds, there's a tremendous amount of volatility right now in that space, whereas people pay their mortgage first. So even though we've seen reductions in the benefit from income tax off of payroll and significant disruption in the marketplace due to unemployment, and of course a significant reduction in sales tax, very hard to pin down right now, we know that at least half of our revenue structure is relatively stable compared to most. Our governing philosophy in the decisions that we make looks an awful lot like Maslow's before Bloom's. And if you're unfamiliar with that, it's worth a Google, but Maslow's hierarchy of needs versus Bloom's taxonomy of instruction. And basically the crux of this is that we focus on the caring for our students' basic needs before addressing our learning objectives. And I think that this is a really important point to make because it helps in terms of establishing a framework for decision making and how we look after our staff and students first and their physical and social emotional needs before we even can get to the learning component. In the earliest phases of the COVID shutdown, we were focusing our energies on how we could pivot operations and instruction to providing the highest level of service to our students with reduced operations. Our guiding question in that early stage was how might we provide continuity of learning in this new dynamic? One of the best and worst elements of the shutdown is how it has exposed the inequities in our communities across the country and how it has widened access and opportunity gaps and exposed that to a greater detail. This is a great reminder that maybe returning to normal isn't what's best for kids because normal wasn't working for all kids. And so that has been a cornerstone of some of the thinking that we've had as we've gone into some of our budget planning. Fortunately for Chesterfield, we are a one-to-one school division in terms of providing one-to-one technology for our secondary students. And we were able to extend this to all grades in our school system by cannibalizing our at-school laptop inventory. We secured local grants to support the purchase of mobile hotspots, which once in place will help to maintain some of that continuity of learning. We have about 58 sites open right now where we're serving meals throughout the day, and we're serving breakfast, lunch, and even dinner in many of our sites and have served over 1 million meals from the middle of March to May 30th. Very important part to keep our kids engaged in the school community through our meal service and also providing for their basic needs, that Maslow's versus Bloom's approach. In an effort to prevent furloughs as a priority early on and to preserve our full-time workforce, we did eliminate our temporary workforce of about 2,000 employees to preserve our full-time workforce of about 8,000 employees. There's also a significant operational savings, obviously, from not transporting students and not running your HVAC systems at full blast, but that doesn't absolve us of the responsibility to maintain our HVAC systems, knowing that HVAC system health moving into a reopening environment for schools is going to be critical. We're going to end up closing out fiscal 20 with a small carryover that we can use for some of our return to learn efforts. Now we've shifted a little bit in our thinking and our energies are more focused on preparing for a safe school opening and closing learning gaps. Our guiding question for today is how might we provide a flexible and safe learning environment for all kids? Consequently, we are targeting the best use of stimulus funds to offset new expenses. As you can imagine, and as I'm sure my colleagues on this panel will discuss in greater detail, CARES Act funding is disproportionately lower to the ERA funding from the Great Recession. So in terms of federal stimulus, it's significantly smaller than what we've seen in the past. But I would categorize our expenses really into 3 categories, and this is where I'll close. Our first priority is obviously personal protective equipment and safety equipment that we can augment the learning environment. Masks, plexiglass sneeze guards, cleaning supplies, and things of that nature. Although I will say that the biggest challenge that we're rubbing up against and where we definitely could use some support and some help is that all of those items have significant supply chain challenges. You may want those items, we want those items, but so does everybody else, and that's caused a significant challenge for us. Our second priority is the social and emotional support for our children and staff returning to the school environment. There's a great deal of trauma from this event and of course other events occurring in our country at this time, and we need to deal with that, and we need to deal with it in a very proactive way. Our third priority is no surprise, is to build up our learning infrastructure for equity of access. We need to address free and appropriate public education for our students with disabilities, and we need to address recovery of learning that's going to take us years. But more importantly is that we need to be able to position ourselves that we can pivot should something like this happen in the future. And I'm pretty sure that that's what the focus of our next focus will be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. And Deputy Superintendent Williams, I'm going to come to you next. And so we'll pull up and think about it more from a state level again. And we did hear reference by Dr. Taylor, the idea of the CARES funding and other federal stimulus funds that have been coming into schools and to states. How we also know that it's not enough to make up for some of the challenges, knowing that we do have increased costs given what's going on, as well as challenges of decreased funding. So what lessons could you share from South Carolina during this period that is learned as it approaches school funding?
Certainly. I think one thing that has become even more apparent through this pandemic is the inequity that exists in digital access across the state of South Carolina. Unfortunately, the ability of the state to provide e-learning to all of our students during the pandemic has been problematic due to not only the lack of devices in some districts for all students, but also the lack of broadband access in certain pockets of the state of South Carolina. Like some other states, South Carolina's had to quickly implement short-term solutions like placing internet hotspots on school buses and strategically placing those buses across the state so that students can complete and submit their classwork. And so from those lessons here at the state level, especially at the South Carolina Department of Education, we plan to utilize a portion of our 9.5% set aside for statewide initiatives in that ESSER allocation that's been allocated to each SEA to focus those efforts on expanding access to learning management systems across the state. And also to build out a statewide learning object repository, which we hope will facilitate greater communication and coordination of work in districts across the state. We have been encouraging school districts to utilize their portion of their ESSER allocations to ensure that there are adequate digital devices for students and teachers. The governor in South Carolina developed a task force called Accelerate SC that was aimed at reopening the state and developing recommendations on how to best spend the $1.9 billion that came to South Carolina in their coronavirus relief funding. And included in those recommendations is roughly $100 million aimed at increasing broadband access and providing hotspots across the state, specifically to help things like education, and then other things like telehealth, telemedicine, things that definitely, thrive based upon the internet. The state of South Carolina has also gleaned the need to provide intensive academic and social emotional support for children whose formal education was disrupted by this pandemic. The state superintendent of education here in South Carolina has recommended funding for an additional 5 days of 4K through 8th grade academic instruction and intervention prior to the start of the traditional school year. And she's now calling that the LEAP program. The objective of that would be to use these 5 days at the start of the school year to evaluate the reading and mathematics skills of students, to identify where students are having trouble because they have not had that direct formal instruction for the last 2 months. In addition, children will be evaluated to determine if there are any social and emotional needs. Based upon the results of those screenings, a personalized instructional plan and supports will be identified for each child to ensure that those needs are met and addressed in the first semester of the 2021 school year. Also here in South Carolina, the state superintendent of education has recommended funding for academic recovery camps. There's a summer camps that would start in July. Students eligible for these summer camps are children in kindergarten through 8th through 3rd grade, who need supplemental learning opportunities to assess those essential skills in reading and in math. And in that proposal, we would be addressing and providing face-to-face instruction at 120 minutes a day in literacy and 50 minutes a day in math for 4 weeks to address some of those issues and things that we've noticed associated with the pandemic and the fact that children have not been able to access the needed services for such a long period of time.
Great. Thank you so much, Deputy Superintendent. Comptroller Hegar, I appreciate the way you laid out how Texas funds its schools. And I'm wondering, given that differential across districts, as some districts are going to be impacted more specifically on local funding, what kind of guidance are you from the state level giving to districts and I guess to the state generally as it looks to set its budgets for the next school year?
Yeah, well, one of the things yesterday, I was on a call much like this one with a lot of the educational leaders that represent different organizations talking about these exact issues because as we all keep repeating, there are so many uncertainties. And then also I try to stay in pretty constant contact every few weeks with our education commissioner here in Texas, just because I need to understand, the vantage point that they see at Texas Education Agency as well as us from a revenue standpoint, so they can make sure we're all disseminating the proper information. And just kind of as a background, a few weeks ago, state leadership ordered agencies to reduce their spending for the remainder of this current budget cycle. Texas, we're not on an annual budget cycle. We do a 2-year budget cycle. So our 2-year budget cycle will end in August of 2021. And however, as tradition, when leadership asked for agencies to cut, they exempted public education funding. And as I noted earlier on the local funding side, Texas values property values as January 1. Thus, the budgets that the schools are setting now and looking at the 2021 year will not be impacted by lower property values. This means that the upcoming budget cycle, neither the state nor local funding has really currently been impacted. But however, with the complication is that anyone trying to project revenues for states, we just have few good data points, and so my point being is, as we're looking into the next budgeting cycle for schools, what is it, which is critical, is since the state makes a large portion of it, what is that impact going to be as we look to next year? And so we have seen, as I mentioned, earlier, that not just Texas, but all the states have seen historically rapid declines in revenues in the last couple of months. And, I've continued to caution that we're probably not going to have a quick V-shaped recovery. Economy will be much more of a prolonged, maybe even a W recovery if we have increased flare-ups in COVID this fall, which I think we all, have concerns with. And in short, my caution is that while the current budget year does not look significantly impacted, the state and districts need to be aware that there's just a tremendous amount of uncertainty there at the state level, the national level, and really even globally in the upcoming few months, and even more so really in the next 6 to 18 months. And another point that was made, and I think Dr. Taylor and Nancy had both made these points a little bit earlier, and kind of as the conversation yesterday reminded me with the school folks here in Texas, is that leading up to the great financial crisis, ISDs had more of a longer runway to start looking at multiple budget cycles. And that's kind of one point I really wanted to stress it in this part, is maybe they're not really impacted as much on the funding side from local property values, nor maybe as much in the upcoming school year from the state side of it. But typically you're going to try to manage what's coming in the next year by managing in this year. And really as I think was mentioned by some of the other speakers, is that, all school districts, here in Texas, we're no different than everybody else. 78 to 88% of all the expenses are people. They're payroll, they're people. And those people are critically important to the education of our children at all levels, K through 12. And so therefore my point being is, if school districts now try to take advantage, okay, we're not going to necessarily give pay increases, or we may not need to do the same hires as we would for this year, as really you're trying to look to the next cycle for the next year. In reality, and the irony is that we're having greater needs for personnel potentially than what we've had in the past because of social distancing. And so therefore you're needing smaller class sizes rather than larger class sizes, which typically ends up happening as the school districts. The first and only place that, you can go do all the the first obvious things, IT purchases, not replace vehicles, but that's not the bulk of the money. The bulk of the money is people. And you know, you need those people for quality education and that support staff, because schools are required to do so much with so many children that have, you know, every child is different, we're all different, and they have those different educational needs. So my point really being is, even though I just want to caution, even though, you know, this cycle does not really seem to impact, as in when I say cycle, I mean this upcoming school year, from a local or a state funding as much, at least here in Texas, those dominoes are really critical, as in how school districts will react in the upcoming year, which is where we know we're going to have some lower property values, as well as we're going to have an impact on state revenues. But then the last question that, you know, we just don't really know completely is all states have gotten a significant number of funding from the federal government. But with that being said, unlike in the past, that's not necessarily used to backfill lost revenue. That is spent for directly COVID type expenses, and the Treasury is given broad discretion, but states have to, and locals have to be very careful to make sure you document everything within the guidance for when the feds do show up, because they're going to show up to audit, and you need to make sure that you have spent those dollars accordingly. So my point being is the challenge is a little bit higher than what we've had in the past for the documentation standpoint of make sure you're spending the dollars within the acceptable areas, even though the Treasury is kind of given broad discretion. And then the question even becomes, as the perception of the recovery, which is occurring, you know, one concern that I have is maybe people think it's occurring quicker than what it really is. And so therefore my point is that states, locals have really significant needs coming up in the immediate, not just the immediate months, but a much longer term, because there's just a lot of uncertainty with what the economic recovery will be locally, nationally, as well as worldwide.
Thank you so much, Comptroller. I'm going to start weaving in some questions from the audience. And Dr. Taylor, I'm going to come to you first. And it's aligned with what you alluded to earlier in thinking about how to deal with increased costs over the next year. But several people have chatted in questions with concerns about how districts are going to be able to ensure that it's safe in the next school year by providing masks, decreasing class sizes, all these things that you all have been talking about. How is it that you as a district are going to make sure that those costs aren't prohibitive and that you're able to help ensure the safety of the students in however you return to school in the fall?
Well, thank you, Patrick. And it's going to be a bumpy road. Right before this session, just chatting with Mr. Hegar, and I want to echo some of his thoughts, is that it's important that we manage some expectations, because there are going to be some significant challenges tied to the reopening of schools. A lot of states have adopted a phased-in approach, which is great from a public health standpoint, but creates some logistical challenges that schools will have to adjust to. I think we're very concerned about how we meet the needs of families who are in a much more impacted community from COVID than other parts in terms of equity of access, but also who potentially could have access to health challenges that we need to address, or healthcare challenges that we need to address. We're very proud of the adopted budget that we came out with in January of this year. And our fiscal 21 budget was remarkable. It had lots of great features in it. Two things that we were particularly proud of is that we had a differentiated staffing to support high poverty schools. We had a pay increase for our staff budgeted, as well as some differentiated funding for some school-based supports that was variable per pupil allocations dependent on various risk categories. Very creative way to address equity in our community. Unfortunately, because of reduced costs, those things are diminished. And when equity was already a concern, this now becomes an even greater concern. In terms of opening school where we are providing that safe and flexible learning environment, there are some significant challenges. And I think the first is one that I've already articulated and has been echoed by Ms. Williams and Mr. Hegar, which is some of the supply chain issues of getting access to supplies to make sure that we have a safe environment, retrofitting our school offices and learning environments with the adequate sneeze guards, or making sure that people are wearing masks and following appropriate risk management approaches is critical. And it's going to be a challenge. And I would imagine that a lot of our constituents may even have some reservations about sending their students to school in this environment. And there's going to be a process where we're going to have to be flexible and have to almost maintain two learning environments at the same time in many regards, almost in a hybrid setting. Something that I think is really important that really hasn't been touched on is the fatigue that our teachers and staff might be experiencing right now, and even catapulting into the next fiscal year, is that this is a lot. And it's putting a lot on them emotionally, it's putting a lot on them physically to be prepared to teach and to promote student learning in a very different environment than the one that they left in the middle of March of this year. So I think that there are a couple things that we need to do. One, we do need to be flexible in terms of being responsive to changes in revenue in Virginia. The things that we're most responsive to would be changes in the income tax and sales tax revenue picture. And so we might take some traditional measures like offering retirement incentives and even hiring freezes and capitalizing on some of the other things that we've already mentioned, just to keep costs under control and being able to pivot in that environment. But we are going to have to spend that money on our existing budgets, as well as any incentive or stimulus money on additional safety equipment and any additional expense that may be tied, and Mr. Hegar alluded to this already, any additional expense which could be significant tied to social distancing, additional staff, additional resources, maybe it's another tier of bus runs, a whole host of things that could be in place to not only get kids to school, but also to maintain the learning environment in a safe way. Building out those frameworks to support both health and social emotional learning is going to require more counselors on staff, as well as more mental health services and even nurses. There's nothing like a global pandemic to underscore the need for a school nurse in every building, which is not a requirement in many states, including Virginia. And building frameworks that support new learning. This is going to require a tremendous amount of professional development, and it's professional development that we're going to have to deliver in a way that our students are now learning because of our new dynamic and our new social distancing requirements. So not only are our kids learning in a new way and in a new space, but our teachers are also going to have to learn in that new space. And cruise liners don't turn on a dime. It's a big mechanism to move school systems and an entire profession. And so how do we get to that place where we can pivot easily? The last little piece that I'll add to that is an operational expense. And a lot of us don't think about some of the nuts and bolts that go into how our systems operate and how we interact with folks. Chesterfield, our school system, we onboard approximately 500 new employees every year. The bulk of that occurs in the summertime, and we do so in large settings. Well, that's now impossible. So pivoting to a virtual onboarding where we are scheduling our fingerprinting operations, which ironically have been suspended by the state at this point, now creates a whole nother challenge and a whole nother layer of, we can even hire the folks, but we can't even get them in to onboard them in the way that we have historically done in the past. And so we have to think differently. We have to design our approaches and to tackle our problems in new and creative ways to fit our new environment. So I hope that answered that question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. So Deputy Superintendent Williams, we have a little under 10 minutes left. And so I wanted to try to get one more question to you and to Comptroller Hegar. But first, you mentioned the importance of equity in the response and ensuring that the funds are being used equitably to serve students. is there, how will the department ensure that those funds are being used well and equitably to serve? Will you look at disaggregating data in the near and medium and long term to ensure that those dollars are getting to the students who most need them? What are some of the strategies you all are thinking about in that way?
Yes, definitely. When it comes to specifically those federal funds that have been disseminated based upon the CARES Act, we're definitely implementing strong monitoring protocols in place to ensure that those funds are used as intended, and it's being used to as best it can to to relieve any inequities, to ensure that the students who need that funding are ultimately receiving the benefit of those funds. So we're working through that right now. Again, like I hate to keep saying the uncertainty, but as things continue to change daily, as we continue to update our plans, as we continue to walk through what reopening will look like, not just for our summer program that's slated to begin in July, but also the 5 early days in August and the start of the new school year. Just walking through all of that, that's kind of what we're doing, and trying to ensure that those funds will be used as intended, with the necessary social distancing in place, as everyone else has spoke of.
Thank you. And we certainly heard that from Superintendent Spearman as well, and know that that is a priority, and appreciate that. Comptroller, I wanted to come to you with a question that was asked as well about rainy day funds. Understanding that Texas has one of the largest in the nation, given its size and where it is, how do you all in Texas look at these funds, and how do you decide to use them both at the state and local levels and in situations like this?
Yeah, good question. What we're fortunate to have a healthy balance, really, because of the activity that's occurred in the oil field here in the last 10 years. And so I expect when the legislature gets back into session, they'll probably have about 8.5 billion or a little bit more in that fund, which is a good tool in the toolbox for us. And so therefore, my point being is that for any expenditures out of that fund, that needs to be both a vote in the Texas House and the Texas Senate of 2/3. So 100 out of the 150 members in the Texas House has to agree, and 21 out of 31 in the state Senate. And so as long as we meet those thresholds, then those dollars can be used for any intended purpose. We used a fair amount of them last session because unfortunately we had a lot of communities impacted by Hurricane Harvey through large parts of the Texas Gulf Coast. So there was more of a historical use of the dollars then. As we get into session, I have no doubt, and I've said the legislature will use some of those dollars without a doubt for either this current biennium and or the next biennium, just depending on what the economic recovery may look like. And then lastly, I get asked quite often is, are we going to have a special session? Because our legislature is not coming back until January, like most states are in now. And in fact, one, how do they even get together in a Capitol because of social distancing? Number two, that's for 30 days. I served as a member for 12 years. They're not going to agree in 30 days, so there's no need to come back. And then lastly, and here's the point that I'm making, is that from a cash flow perspective, that economic stabilization fund gives me as the treasurer a good tool that I can for cash flow purposes. And so we will use part of that for our cash flow, because we do another thing that's historically different than many other states. We send our school districts in September, October, and November, the first 3 months of our fiscal year, we will send our school districts about 50% of their stateside funding. Since they don't get their property taxes till January, we made a conscious decision about 4 decades ago that any borrowing needed for cash flow would be done on the state level instead of the local school districts from a pricing standpoint and just a economy of scale. And so therefore, that's one reason I will need to use part of that money, and I have in the past, just for cash flow, as we go through the fall months. But it'll be up to the legislature come next session. As I've said over and over in every speech I've given, there's no doubt they will tap into the ESF because of the unfortunate circumstances we find ourselves right now economically.
Great, thank you. I want to give each of you one more brief opportunity, if you wouldn't mind keeping it 60 seconds or less, so we don't go too far over. But I'd love from each of your perspectives, as other local school business officials across the country are thinking about next year, what is the one piece of advice you would give to them as they approach this very challenging discussion. And Comptroller, I'll come to you next.
Well, I mean, I think, what am I to tell people on education? All I have is a 15-year-old, a 12, and a 12-year-old. So I'm looking at it from a small prism. But I think both the Deputy Superintendent and Dr. Taylor both summed up a lot. I mean, it's more than just education, and there's a lot of mental issues. There's a lot of trauma issues, and there's a lot of equity issues. And we've known that in Texas, being that we're growing in population, but we're growing more in those groups that are economically disadvantaged. And I think this, unfortunately, COVID has highlighted that we've got to do a lot better. And I mean that from a state level more so than a local level, to close those gaps than we ever have. If we're going to let these kids even begin to catch up what they've lost, much less an economic opportunity in the future as they get higher education opportunities.
Yeah, great point. Dr. Taylor, come to you next.
Thank you. I think if this has taught us anything, it's that grace and flexibility really need to rule the day. And I would encourage everybody who's working with us in partnership, which is everybody, that we are doing the best we can with what we have, and to encourage the support of our boots on the ground educators. Our teachers are working incredibly hard, and to encourage policymakers to hold K-12 harmless in the event that that drastic decisions need to be made, but also to be mindful of the fact that there are some complex movements behind the scenes, and that there are some things that we can invest in that can simultaneously help keep the economy afloat, but then also provide for the safety and welfare of our staff and students. But I think grace and flexibility just rule the day, and having compassion for one another is really important now more than ever.
Well said. Thank you. And we'll close out with you, Deputy Superintendent Williams.
I think I'd just say to continue to put the academic and the social and emotional needs of students above everything else. Continue to strive to be as prudent as possible to preserve the integrity of the instructional program, and to avoid any disruptions as much as possible down to the local classroom level. Just the safety and health of these children is paramount.
Great. Thank you so much. So again, thank you to all three of you. We know you have a lot you could be doing right now, but I think everybody who joined today felt that they were able to walk away with some really helpful information. So thank you all again for joining us today. We're sorry for those of you who asked questions when we weren't able to get to them. We appreciate how many questions did come in. If you have any others, please feel free to tweet them using the hashtag #INTWebinar, and we will try to get back to you with some answers or point you in the right direction if we can. As I mentioned earlier, we will be posting a recording of this presentation and a recap on our blog early next week, so look out for that. Finally, we do have some other upcoming webinars that I think will be of interest for many of you, starting in just 2 days, where we'll have Todd Penner from the Michael and Susan Dell Foundation and Bill Tucker from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation talking about some of the disruptions in the higher education student pipeline right now. And then we have a good early childhood conversation next week, where we'll be joined by Bezos Family Foundation, the Pritzker Children's Initiative, and the Bainham Family Foundation. And then we continue our conversations with our state superintendents and commissioners the following week. And we have another upcoming conversation with Lieutenant Governors, with Lieutenant Governor Bethany Hall Long of Delaware and Lieutenant Governor Billy Nungesser of Louisiana. So be on the lookout for all those. We once again, I want to thank our three panelists for sharing their time and their wisdom with us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon, and please don't hesitate to reach out if the Hunt Institute can be a resource for you.